It's only a few months ago that a number of states were working with Iran to descale the tension. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they all had deals with Iran. They knew how dangerous the situation was. They should not let Iran dictate a situation now of preventing an end to the conflict in Gaza.
Well, the US National Security spokesman John Kirby has promised a very consequential response to the attack on its base in Jordan that killed 3 servicemen. They've been named as Sergeants William Jerome Rivers, Kennedy Layden Sanders and Breonna Alexandria Moffat, all from an Army Reserve unit based in Georgia. 40 others were injured in the attack on the base near the border with Syria. John Kirby said the Biden administration is weighing its options, but he played down the prospect of direct confrontation with Iran.
We do not seek another war. We do not seek to escalate. But we will absolutely do what is required to protect ourselves, to continue that mission, and to respond appropriately to these attacks. Now, I know the first set of questions I'm going to get are, well, what does that look like? What's appropriate? And what response options is the president considering? I hope you can understand why I'm not going to telegraph any punches here from the podium, nor will I get in front of the president or his decision-making. He's met twice with his national security team yesterday and today. He's weighing the options before him. As he said yesterday, we will respond. We'll do that on our schedule.
Well, Iran has denied any direct connection with the strike, but appeared to confirm it was carried out by militias loyal to Tehran. And the Pentagon's deputy press secretary said the attack was carried out by a militia backed by Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and that Iran have their fingers on this. Well, let's speak to Alistair Burt, former Foreign Office Minister for the Middle East. He was also a Minister of State at the Department for International Development. Good evening. Great to have you with us.
Oh, Karen, it's lovely to see you.
What do you make of those signals that we're hearing from the United States tonight?
Well, it's a measure of the dilemma that the United States faces. It doesn't want to escalate into a war with Iran, which Iran seems not to want either, although they're pushing what is known in the trade as the threshold pretty far. And the United States has a number of options. It's not going to say at this stage what it might do. The worst of the options might be an attack on Iran itself, which would be seen as an escalation. But as Tehran admits, and everyone knows, they have militias operating in Syria and Iraq under control of the IRGC, so they would seem to be a possible target. But America knows if it does nothing, then people are going to question its deterrent capacity. And if it does too much, people will say it's escalating into a war. So it's a dilemma for the White House tonight.
Yeah, and it is a very difficult and a dangerous dilemma, isn't it? Because, as you say, it seems that with every passing day, there is a further risk of the West being drawn directly into this conflict. And whenever and wherever it does strike at Iran, that could potentially lead to further reprisals, if not from Iran itself, then from its many other proxies in the region.
It could. We're in a situation where, because of the lack of accountability of militia groups, everything from the Houthi to those operating in Syria and Iraq and Hezbollah, the world focuses on states and those that have some sort of democratic accountability. And the questioning is always about, well, why are they doing what they're doing, as opposed to putting the accountability for escalation on the terror groups that are doing it. But the terror groups know this full well. I think there's sometimes a risk in the West. We work to a narrative which we think is ours and we think must be correct, and that is whose fault it is. It's not seen that way in the region we're talking about, where sometimes it's seen to be right to be resisting what they consider to be attacks from the West. And we have to be very conscious of the narrative that other people have and not play into that. That heightens the risk and the dilemma. But if nothing is done, then it would appear that those authoritarian tendencies and those who can use militias to operate for their own benefit will gain the upper hand still further.
Do you think there is a risk of President Biden being almost goaded into taking tougher action because of the presidential election? We've already had Donald Trump saying, oh, well, this attack only happened because of the weakness of the president. Now, when John Kirby, the national security spokesman, was asked about this, he dismissed the idea of any political calculations. But there must be some, mustn't there?
I think President Biden is probably the least likely of people to react to a political situation and seek some sort of advantage. Of course, he's aware of the election, but he's also aware it cuts both ways. Being in the United States regularly, sort of since 2010, and hearing the Americans' reaction to their boys being overseas, we in the United Kingdom shouldn't underestimate the very strong feeling in the United States of wanting to bring their troops back home. That was what was behind Afghanistan and all that. And so President Biden will know the risk of appearing to commit to more just as much as he will know the risk of not doing anything. But I don't think he's likely to respond to something just because it's a political gamble for the election, but he will weigh his options very carefully.
We're hearing also tonight reports that Israel has agreed on a framework for the release of the remaining American and Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. Hamas has put out a statement suggesting that it's looking for a complete and sustained ceasefire. So there's clearly some way to go. But we're also hearing warnings apparently from the Qataris, who are key intermediaries in all of this, that any strike on an Iranian target could make it even harder to get a deal. I mean, it just underlines the complicated, multi-dimensional chess game here.
It does. Again, we like to try and separate issues, but in the region, the narrative is strongly controlled by what's happening in Gaza, and everything is connected to that, even though we do not see that. So whatever the imperatives might be at the moment, bringing the fighting in Gaza to a conclusion is absolutely vital, not just for its own reason, not just for the sake of relieving the pressure on Gaza and the population there, but also for the return of the hostages. The hostage families said tonight that when there is a pause, hostages are released. When the fighting continues, the hostages come back dead. So that pressure is very strong in relation to Israel. Everything points to the determination of many of the people there to seek a pause and a ceasefire. But equally, Hamas will know that that political pressure adds weight to their position, which is they want all their prisoners back, and they will only do a deal for maximum benefit for them.
And Hamas are the ones that are holding the hostages. Yes. I mean, they are in a very strong position in these negotiations, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, nobody likes to admit this because of how this all began on October the 7th with an unconscionable attack on Israel. But the reality of life is that when you look at the situation now, everything Israel has done to try and relieve the situation, get the hostages back, deal with Hamas, has not worked. And they're faced with a situation where they cannot deliver militarily, and they cannot deliver diplomatically unless they get the support of Hamas. But other states in the region need to consider what they can do. It's only a few months ago that a number of states were working with Iran to descale the tension. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they all had deals with Iran. They knew how dangerous the situation was. They should not let Iran dictate a situation now of preventing an end to the conflict in Gaza. So the interlocking pieces of the jigsaw are not just about Western considerations, but Arab considerations and considerations in the region for a rather different future for the Middle East. This is an opportunity for them.
Let me just ask you about the situation in Gaza. The US, the UK, Japan and Austria have joined now today in suspending payments to the UN relief agency, UNRWA, because of allegations that some of its staff were actually involved in those October the 7th attacks on Israel. It is perhaps understandable that they've made that decision, but what about the effect that is going to have on the ground in Gaza?
It's very significant. If I'd still been in the office, I would have advised against withholding funds from UNRWA on the basis that I think you should separate the two things. Of course, it's wrong for any UNRWA operatives to be operating for Hamas, and the allegations made are extremely serious, and of course they should be investigated and people should be out of UNRWA. But UNRWA's work in delivering aid is extremely comprehensive in the region. Sooner or later, that will have to be replaced. The money and support will have to be replaced. And then you have a difficult decision. Well, why should you replace it after you took it away? I think it would have been better to make a distinction between UNRWA's work in delivering aid and the necessary work that needs to do to identify and bring to justice anyone who was involved in the October 7th attack. But penalising UNRWA as a whole, and above all penalising those who depend on support and the aid support, which UNRWA distributes on behalf of other people, I think a little bit of thought would have tried to find a slightly different answer. But maybe that can be rectified soon. Having made this statement about it, perhaps there is another way forward in resuming the aid, but being very clear on the distinction between those who've committed acts which ought to be condemned and investigated, but drawing a distinction between that and the aid that's necessary.
Alistair Burt, former Foreign Office Minister, really good to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carol. Nice.